morning, everyone. Konnichiwa. 안녕하세요. Okay, that's about 2 sentences I can speak in Korean and Japanese. Hi, sawadika. Okay. Very fair. 1 sentence for 1 country. My name is Xun Kuo. I'm from NCDR. And it's my pleasure to be here to share some of the work we've done in NCDR and also in Taiwan about the local disaster reduction strategy. I think the same with the professor before. Like, I was also assigned for this mission 2 weeks ago. So as you will see, I need to apologize that you don't have my slides in your binders, and you will get the electronic files if you are interested. And as you can see, I'm from Management and Socio-Economic System Division. It's quite a unique division in NCDI's kind of soft science, and also from the we'll see from non-disaster professionals disciplines. And I also work on the disaster impact and risk reduction on climate change project at NCDR. So today I'm going to share some work made from different perspectives on adaptation bottleneck and how to maybe we can propose a framework to break through this implementation gap. Okay, here's my presentation outline. We will it's divided in 4 sections, and I'm trying to answer those questions, like what are urban disaster risks now and maybe in the future, and what climate change adaptation strategies have done in Taiwan at local and also maybe at national levels, and what is the local adaptation plan project now, and what's the problem now, and maybe we can have some key issues that maybe we can discuss later, and in the end is our proposed framework. So, as you are probably more familiar with me, more familiar than me, is that the global natural disaster event happens every year. In last year, I think there were over 300 events global-wise, and we will wonder how many were located in the urban area. Let's see, what happened last year is New York City is a big metropolitan area. We have Hurricane Sandy, and also like the Dr. Chen spoke yesterday, the Beijing rainfall in July, and also last December, Philippines also have another one very damaging typhoon, Alpha. Okay, so we'll see that even though some other disaster might not happen in the big metropolitan area, but we'll see other disasters also happen in human settlements. So when natural hazard hit human settlement, we'll see this happened last 2 weeks, also in Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan. We'll see the disaster will cause great impact in urban area, and with the risk might cause because the decline in socio-economic environmental condition, like we have more groups with low capacity, like more elderly people. For Taiwan, maybe for Japan, there is aging society, and maybe for more low-income families. And there's also a factor is urbanization. There are more people and more properties, more assets at stake. The people and company industry are centralized in big city. There's also another trend is climate change. We have more intense and more frequent extreme climate events. These 3 trends and 3 cause 3 risk driving factors, cause high vulnerability maybe high exposure and more intense hazard. We'll see the urban disaster risk in the future will be increasing. So there's one quote from Darwin. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So that taught us that we need to learn to adapt, and especially for disaster, those dramatic, drastic changes. So the future disaster risk management strategy, we were thinking that it needs to adopt a more comprehensive paradigm. It needs a paradigm shift, which means in addition to the emergency response that we have done, we need to maybe shift our focus on the risk reduction strategy. And the second one, we probably need to trace back to upstream driving factors, like I mentioned earlier, the vulnerability and exposure. Those factors, we need to think about how to reduce those vulnerability part. And the third one is we try to think about what will happen in the future. So we need to consider the factor of the climate change. So the disaster risk management strategy is probably need to integrate with climate change adaptation. So what climate change adaptation strategy have been developed in Taiwan? As we will see, I think it's probably for many countries, it's the same, or like the temperature in Taiwan, the annual mean temperature has increasing, and the number of high temperature days has increasing. Already the number of extreme cold event has decreased. For the precipitation, the scientists in Taiwan has found that the total annual precipitation has not changed significantly, but the annual total rain days has decreased, which means we have more intense rain days. And the sea level rise is another issue. And this is the report, scientific report released in 2011. It's a project funded by National Science Council and a project called TCCIP, which NCDI also participate in the project. So for those climate change impacts, we have to do something, right? So Taiwan has tried to make efforts on climate change adaptation since 2010. In central government part, like I said, NSC has 3 climate change study projects. One is TCCIP, another one is called TICAD and CLICS. And for the CEPD, is Council for Economic Planning and Development. They has a project called National Adaptation Strategy and also National Adaptation Action Plan, which was carried on right now, like this year. And CEPD also have another project try to promote the adaptation at local level. So at local government level, they have one pilot project for local adaptation plan, and then they have the main project, local climate change adaptation plan project. Also, we have tried to reach the idea to the society. So for the public participation part, the CEPD also launched a website, Taiwan Climate Adaptation Platform, and the website link is here. And it's very interesting because the title of the website is called Building the Ark Together. So we need to sort of figure out how we can survive for the future risk. And also there are so many education and training activities. Okay, this is the link. I believe they have not had the English version, but you can see it's like information platform. So they have some scientific knowledge experts and national government agency and local agency can go up there to find information, to share the information. Okay, for first, the national adaptation strategy to climate change in Taiwan. It was initiated by the National Council for Sustainable Development, and then they have one task force for the climate change adaptation. Under this mechanism, there are 8 sectors identified as the key issues that Taiwan need to tackle, like disaster, infrastructure, water resources, land use, coastal zones, energy supply and industry, agricultural production, and biodiversity and health. As you can see, the disaster risk is the foremost issue. So you may wonder why disaster is prioritized at the adaptation agenda in Taiwan. There's some issues. The first one is the increased extreme events is evident in recent 10 years. It's a scientific evidence that people will, when they think about climate change, they think about extreme climate events. So we are facing the typhoon with extreme rainfalls and also the intense rainfall in short time. It's near the world record. So this is a challenge we need to encounter. The second reason is, as you might see, disaster will affect other sectors. So it's highly related or relevant to other sectors. So for disaster management in Taiwan, like we sort of need to produce the information beforehand, so that other sector might take the information so they can develop their plan. The third reason is actually the Taiwanese society view disaster reduction as very important issues. You may see it's like a political correctness issue. So it's probably no one will argue that we need to do the disaster reduction. So it's a little more detailed introduction on the disaster sector part. We need to face the challenge on increasing intensive and frequency of the extreme event, including the flooding and compound soil water disaster, and also those typhoon may threaten our society's capacity. So the ultimate objective is to reduce the climate change-induced disaster risk, and by strengthening the overall adaptive capacity, and also by implementing the adaptation policy. 6 strategies have been developed. The first one is probably the most important one. We need to assess the climate change disaster risk and develop the early warning information system, and also re-evaluating the vulnerability and capacity of the existing major public infrastructure. And also for the future major construction, we might need to consider the climate change impact. And for the river basin management, Dr. Chen mentioned yesterday, and also the capacity building part. So these 6 strategies are the main strategy we develop in disaster sector. And disaster sector is coordinated by National Science Council and also NCDR, which involving around like 18 government agencies. So in this disaster sector action plan, there are probably 48 action plans in total. As to the local climate change adaptation plan project, it started last year. It began with a pilot project occurred in 2 cities. One is Taipei City, which is like high population density city. Another one, Pingtung County, is south of Taiwan, is relatively lower population county. The end result is they produce not only the 2 plans for those 2 cities, but they will also develop a local climate change adaptation planning guideline. So the CEPD can use the guideline to promote in the main project in 10 other cities and counties. It's actually development right now, so there will be like 10 local climate change adaptation plan in 10 cities. So next step, in addition to the national adaptation strategy and also local adaptation plan, we will need to have a national climate change adaptation action plan. It's like what, how we're going to achieve those strategies and objectives. So there will be 4 parts. One is we realize the enabling condition, enabling environment is still very important, including the institutions like the laws and also the authority of governmental agencies. And then like the economic instrument and maybe finance policies needs to be established. And also the building capacity and public participation part. The second part will be the climate change risk assessment and planning. I think in 2 years, there will be a report published about the climate change risk assessment in Taiwan. And then they will use the result of this risk assessment report to plan for the next stage of the climate change adaptation plan in Taiwan. The third one will be the comprehensive adaptation project for high-risk areas. And the first demo project will be in North Metropolitan Area, Taipei, New Taipei City, Taoyuan County. So we will try to think about how to do the adaptation in an integrated sector, like in metropolitan areas sector. Then the fourth part will be the sectoral action plan, like 8 sectors. They will develop they have already developed their action plan, but they will implement those action plans. So it looks very nice that Taiwan has done a lot of things, but we will try to analyze a little bit detail and maybe provide a preliminary analysis and some problem to share with you. So for the urban disaster risk, so we will see how is the local adaptation plan project. We will think how does it work. So it actually begins with CEPD, but it provides subsidy. So it's like the financial incentive for the city. It's not much, but for city it's some subsidy so they can carry out the whole process. But CEPD also has an expert group. They will work together with CT and also the local planning team to develop. They will formulate a local adaptation platform. The local adaptation platform includes many stakeholders, the city government officials, and the local planning team. They will develop the local adaptation plan. So there will be some education and training. As you might know, some local government officials may not be that familiar with climate change science. So there are some education and training, and there are a lot of meetings, like meetings in the city and meeting with the city with the experts. It's like a participant communication process. So the end result is each city will have one local adaptation plan. It's like one document. Like it's actually one report. And the structure of the report is, you can see from slide, including the local natural, social, economic characteristic, and the chapter 4 is the climate change trend analysis and impact assessment, which most of the city will retrieve the information from the NSC project, the TCCIP project. And then they will have their own prioritized adaptation sector assessment, vulnerability assessment, and they will have a thorough existing policy evaluation. And they have their city's adaptation visions, key issues, objectives, strategy, and then action plan, implementation plan. The good part is it's a thorough review on existing policies, because they involve pretty much a lot of government agents at local level. So the government officials have to attend the meeting, they have to attend the interviews, they have to go through their existing policy. And so the process is also a legit and inclusive process. It's a multi-agency cooperation, and then they do understand the local vulnerability through the process, and through the process they also build up their own capacity. But not so good part is the one we observe. The one problem we observe is that there's low relevance between climate driving forces and resulting adaptation policy. So one of my colleagues has said, they read the report and they say if you take out the chapter 4, it will not make. He thinks it will not make a difference. So the problem is, why is the climate change trend information analysis impacts has not been integrated into the adaptation policy? So what's the problem? So we have to see how we formulate climate adaptation policy. Actually, there are two approaches. One is top-down approaches from maybe original from the IPCC's CCIAV process. It goes down from the global level. They use the global climate models. They downscale it to know the regional or maybe local impacts and those physical vulnerability. And there's another approach, is probably from UNDP, adaptation policy framework. It called it from bottom-up approach. They review the vulnerability at local level, those indicators like economic, social vulnerability. Then they review their own adaptive capacity, their own vulnerability. So there are two approaches to address climate adaptation policy. We will feel like, wouldn't it be great if two approaches can be used, and then decision makers can have all kinds of information. So they have the climate information from at global level, they have the information at local level. Wouldn't it be great for decision makers? They have all information, they can figure out how to make an adaptation policy. But it's not easy because there's something called adaptation bottleneck. It's when decision makers have reached, even though when they have a high level of awareness of climate change at their country or at their city, but they have difficulty to identify and maybe implementing the specific adaptation policy measures. So they probably know the climate scientific information, but how to use those information into their policy is an implementation gap. One of the reasons might be a lack of awareness of vulnerability to current or the future climate, and so it is necessary to break through this adaptation bottleneck, because who might need to know the generic climate change impacts. Those information needs to be translated into decision-making process and actions. So there are some key issues need to overcome the adaptation bottleneck. The first one is we probably need to identify who is responsible for developing what information. So one sector might be climate scientist sector, and we have another end is called decision maker or policy maker sectors. So who is responsible for develop what information? We probably need to identify those actors. And the second, we need to identify what information is required and what information is missing. For example, we will find the climate scientist might talk about, okay, we would know using our project model the temperature or rainfall by the end of this century. So what does this information mean for policymakers? So the policymaker might think about, should we issue a permit for this wetland development project? Should we raise the standard of river walls? So we figure out those two actors need to link more closely. And so from science to policy, there's still a huge gap. Another issue is we need to clarify what information is relevant to policy. So it's probably we call it user-driven or demand-driven strategy. So we need to know what policymakers need, and perhaps we can provide those policy-relevant scientific information to those policymakers. And third, we need to try to understand each other's information. It's very interesting cartoon. When I Google the climate scientist, I realized there are so many cartoons. So we'll see one part is the scientists, they are trying to use the graph, the model, to assess the impact of climate change. And they use the data, everything. But the politician will formulate the policy based on the voting intention surveys, opinion polls. So those two perceptions are quite different. So we need to maybe transfer those this relationship to a more close relationship. So it's a cartoon. It's called How the Climate Scientists Day. So it just means that the two communities probably need to work more close together. So it's for the last part, concluding remarks. We have one proposal and ongoing framework we are doing at NCDR. It's actually quite interesting. It's actually we just need to find a fortune tellers between the climate scientists and the decision makers. If we need to, so we can see the local level, they might have their policy planner, policy planning team, but we need the one of the most important actors is risk analysis, which means we need to use the climate change information to formulate risk information. What does it mean in terms of disaster risk, and what does it mean for the disaster risk reduction strategy? So NCDR and also TCCIP, also the L4 project, which current the project this year, we have actually integrated many different teams. For TCCIP, we have a team working on climate information, whether it's observation data or also the projection data, the downscaling project data. And we also have another team work on information translation. Then we have a risk analysis during the risk develop the model for river basin and drought part. So we will use the model to assess the risk. We also have a team work on climate change risk map in terms of I think coastal disaster, flooding, drought risk map. Okay. Then we have another team, which I'm part of the team, is we try to integrate those information. Maybe next year we'll have a climate change disaster risk assessment report, so that the decision makers can have those information. As we'll see, to overcome those information gap, we'll have the scientific knowledge, translation and integration, so the decision maker can have a more clear scientific information so that they can work on their policy. However, there are still some caveats for local disaster reduction strategy. The first one, what and how much can a local government do in terms of disaster risk reduction? So the authority and responsibility of a single local government might be limited in terms of the risk, the disaster risk. So it's very important to formulate the local and central government relationship. So the local government can obtain the subsidy from the central government to for their disaster reduction strategy, whether it's structural measure or non-structural measure. And then there's also local government relationship in terms of if like the river management or other issues is beyond their administration boundary. So it's probably necessary for the local government need to formulate a relation to their neighboring governments. And also there might be some capacity limitation. So in the process, you need to also formulate to build the capacity running out of time. So another problem we probably need to consider is administration fragmentation and interagency collaboration. As you might know, the disaster issue and climate change issue are both interdisciplinary and interagency issues, including so many agents like fire department, environmental protection department, water resource, etc. So there will be, it's necessary to have a coordination mechanism so that every agency, they can work on the one common missions. We need to refine the participation approach, like the representatives, like whose opinion should be included. And also very important, local knowledge need to be integrated, like the local vulnerability. Probably no one is more familiar with those local risks than the residents. Then the science-based vulnerability and capacity assessment. It's right now the practice is like a subjective assessment. So they call off the experts. They ask them what do they think is vulnerable, and they rank the level of vulnerability. So, but there might be a essential to have an objective measurement and assessment. And so it's very important to have a thorough selection of meaningful indicators and weighting system. And the last part is those strategies should trace back to original risk factor. So the disaster risk reduction strategy cannot just be the emergency response strategy or structural strategy. You need to figure out what caused the risk. Like when I say the vulnerability or exposure, it might correspond to the land use planning problem. We need to tackle those problems. And maybe we need to raise our capability, so we need to change the standard or the code for the river wall or something. Okay, the last slide. I'm gonna use a ET photo to conclude my presentation. I think even though they are from different planets, speaking different languages, like the climate scientists and policymakers, we should still try our best to connect. And I think the adaptation bottleneck can only be broken through when different communities begin to communicate and to collaborate. So that's my presentation. Thank you for your attention.